Okay.
Oh, right. Can you all go on mute as well?
I've got
Let me just mute. That's it. So the recording has started, everyone. So Mark, if you'd like to fire away.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just briefly put my camera on so you can see who's talking to you. And it's great to see such a good turnout. I hope I don't disappoint. Marge mentioned the Freedom of Information request. This was in preparation for making a response to the Places for Everybody consultation. In previous iterations of that, Greater Manchester Spatial Framework and so on, I'd both discussed with some of the officers involved, but also put into previous responses the point really that they should be calculating or at least estimating the carbon implications of the plan, and doing that in terms of what kind of loss capture will there be when you lose green spaces, what kinds of additional emissions there will be as a result of the development. And this time round, again, it didn't appear to be anywhere in the documentation. So I did the Freedom of Information request to the GMCA, and they wrote back saying that the information is there already in the public domain, and they pointed me to various documents, which when I looked at them, clearly, despite having been quite specific in what I was asking for, that information wasn't there. So then I did some work to try and estimate the implications of the scheme as a whole. And slight embarrassment, I managed at one point to confuse my my spreadsheet, my tons and my kilotons, and came up with an estimate that was 1,000 times too much. So be forewarned, always check your calculations, and if possible to get somebody else to check them. So with that kind of caution, I'm going to now go through a presentation where I'll take you through the issues involved. Any questions at that point? Okay, let me see if I can share my screen then. I'm not really used to Teams, I usually use Zoom. Can you see that?
Not yet, Mark.
Ah.
Did have it before. So if you share your content with the little white box with the up arrow, and
oh yeah,
that's it. We can see it now.
And you can see, yeah, okay.
We can see your screen. We just need you to go to the presentation.
Okay. Can you now see the slides?
We
okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't say I'm from a group called Steady State Manchester. That's our logo, which will appear at the bottom of each of these slides. And we work on trying to understand the possibilities of an economy and society that doesn't rely on continual economic growth. That's really what we're about. And we've been going for nearly 10 years now, doing this work, trying both to promote the idea of a post-growth economy, but also to explore what it might look like, with a particular emphasis on the regional scale or the sub-regional scale, that of Greater Manchester as a city region or an eco-region. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now then is I'll first give you a quick overview of the question of carbon in land and in developments. Developments being a slightly problematic word, but basically we've been building, but we will kind of use that term from time to time, I'm sure. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about what I've found out and about the characteristics of the new Carrington site, and we'll use that really as a case study. I'm not sure if there are people from other groups here, but maybe they'll look at the recording as well. And I think we've mentioned that I'll try and, I've already started, trying to turn some of this material into a kind of workbook that community and campaigning groups and interested citizens can then use. But we'll use New Carrington as a case study for these purposes. Then thirdly, I'll go through the various sources that you can use for data for making calculations of carbon fluxes, stores, embodied and operational emissions. And don't worry, I will explain those terms. Then I'll show you some sample calculations I've done for New Carrington, and then I'll talk a bit about the limitations of this work. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a diagram that basically explains or summarizes the kinds of carbon transactions that go on. If we look at the left-hand side, this is land with no buildings on it, and we're interested in a number of things here. We've got some green growth, we've got trees, and we've got various plants, and those plants have a particular significance because they capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They turn it into sugars, which they then turn into cellulose and so on, starch, and which they then use for their own growth. And that locks the carbon away, both in the plant matter, but also when they decay in the soil. And different kinds of vegetation, different kinds of ecosystems, if you like, different kinds of soils have different properties in terms of carbon storage. So there's an important distinction here between the store of carbon in both the living matter and in the soil, and also in the dead organic matter that may be lying on top of the soil, and the flux, by which we mean both the loss of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and the capture or the sequestration of carbon by the living matter. So we're talking about both those dimensions here. Now, we use the term carbon as a shorthand. Really, we're interested here in greenhouse gases, of which the most common is carbon dioxide, and that's the one that enters into these relationships with living things. There are other greenhouse gases, and their quantity, their proportion in the atmosphere, is expressed in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So in terms of the equivalent global warming effect, as if they were carbon dioxide, so it's all converted into the same metric. The other significant ones are methane and nitrogen oxides. Now, what happens then when you put buildings on the land? A number of things happen. We get some emissions. We get two kinds of emissions. We get emissions in the manufacture of the buildings, both in terms of that manufacture that takes place off-site. So if you think, for example, of a brickwork somewhere, then you've got furnaces and kilns kind of making the bricks, fuel being burnt and so on. So you've got emissions going out there. And those emissions are described as embodied emissions because they're kind of represented in the building materials. And then we've also got the emissions from the construction process itself, so from the machinery that's used in the construction particularly. And then we've got the operational emissions, so they're the lifetime emissions from the buildings. So people are living in them, they're heating them, they're lighting them, they're running their laptops and so on, and doing all sorts of things like that. And that's all using energy, and that is producing emissions either directly, so from in my house, I've got a gas boiler, hope to replace at some point. That's churning out carbon dioxide as I speak. But also because I'm using electricity and the electric grid is not completely decarbonised yet, there are emissions going out from the power stations, but they are attributable to the activities in the building. And then the soil and vegetation gets disturbed during building, so you're also getting some emissions. And I don't know if you can see my pointer sort of here, I've represented that here, coming up from the soil and the vegetation into the atmosphere as well, which is a particular important issue for us. I've put a little token plant or tree here, just to sort of recognise that not all the vegetation from the left side of the picture will be lost. There will be vegetation, so properly we should really try and take account of that as well. And of course, often you get promises from developers that they will be planting trees to offset the emissions. But there are some real issues about that, because young trees take a while to lock away those the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and essentially to compensate for everything that goes on in the production of the buildings. The other thing to think about is the opportunity lost. So here on the left-hand side, we've got some land, and thinking of New Carrington, we've got some rather degraded peatland there, which is mostly probably losing carbon dioxide and methane and so on into the atmosphere. But that could be improved. The peat could be re-wetted, different practices in terms of cultivation could take place, and you could lock away more carbon. On the non-peat bits, you could be planting more woodland and growing more woodland, or the kinds of grassland that's also very good at sequestering carbon. So by building, you're losing that opportunity to improve the sequestration. Okay. I can either take questions. I've got a number of slides to get through, so I think maybe it's best perhaps if we try and deal with, if you hold your questions, and we'll deal with them at the end, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay then. So let's have a quick look at the New Carrington site. This is one that I think originally came from the Trafford master plan, the New Carrington master plan. And here's basically an overview of the development. This red line goes around the site. That's what we're talking about. And some of that site is already industrial, these bits here, and some is kind of covered in things like playing fields and so on. There's an area down here which to me looks like rather degraded kind of agricultural land. I can't quite work out what's going on there, but there seem to be a lot of sort of muddy tracks and tractors and bulldozers and things there.
Lots of flooding, Mark. Lots of flooding.
Yeah. Yes. And that too. Yeah. And then we've got, you can see the number of homes that are going to be planned to be built, and the employment sites as well. I won't go into too much detail with that, so I'm going to come back to it. What's underneath it, though? That's kind of what I'm really interested in. So this overlay shows the extent of the underlying peat. So what I've done is I've simply superimposed on the previous map the outline of the peatland that's there. So you can see that a significant amount of the site is actually peatland. And peatland is particularly significant in terms of the carbon metrics. There is also, though, and if you look at an aerial photo, you'll see a lot of woodland as well, particularly on this area here, on the eastern side. I think there's a certain amount down towards the south here too, if I remember rightly. And there's also seems to be what looks like scrubland as well. There's some cultivated land, particularly in this area and sort of down here. So it's quite a mix of different kinds of land types, and there's some playing fields. This picture shows the other soil types. The previous one was the peat. Now the shape of the peat area differs slightly here because I've taken this from a different survey. They're both from the UK Soil Observatory, and it's a fantastic site that you can play with and look at the maps, and you can basically superimpose these different kinds of soil types and so on it, different soil surveys on it. But really the area we're concerned with, it's these two. It's the raised peat bog and the naturally wet, very acid, sandy and loamy soils. How much peat? Well, I calculated it at 3.62 square kilometres or 362 hectares. I did this by using a really handy tool called the georeferencer site, which you can access via the British Library and other places. It allows you to upload your own map and superimpose it on other maps. And because it's got a measuring tool, you can then you make these sort of measures and measure distances and so on. So it's really quite nice. You can change the transparency, so you can sort of play about with it. You can superimpose more than one map and so on. One of the tools that are really quite useful in this work. If we are assuming that it's, I think, 2 to 3 meters deep, the peat, then we're talking about 9 million cubic meters, that kind of ballpark figure. A lot of peat, a lot of carbon locked away there. Okay, so I'm afraid these next slides, they're kind of rather a lot of text on them. I'll just orientate you to the key points here, and I'll make this available so you can study them at your leisure. So thinking of the land stores, the carbon stores in the land, and the carbon fluxes, in other words, the balance between carbon capture or sequestration and emissions. There are 2 really useful reports here from the Natural England team. Isabel Alonso and her colleagues have done these reports. They're quite detailed. The first was back in 2012, and just this year it's been updated in this one by Greg and colleagues, and it's tremendously detailed. There's a tremendous amount of information in there that's really useful. And although there's the 2 reports don't overlap completely, so it's also worth for some land types referring back to the Alonso report. So a kind of headline finding from that is that for the peat store, just only for the top 15 centimetres of soil in fen, marsh and swamp and bog, so they're putting the various types together. Something like, if you then extrapolate that to half a metre, 50 centimetres, you've got 259 tonnes of carbon per hectare. A lot of carbon locked away there. And then you've got another 2 tonnes probably for the vegetation. So most of it's in the soil, but there's some in the vegetation. It's likely, though, to be an underestimate, especially where sphagnum moss and trees are growing. They also cite an interesting figure, though, from actually from Little Woolden, which is over the other side of the Ship Canal, up in the, if I remember rightly, the Salford borough. And that's actually an arable site on peatland, and there they're giving a much bigger figure, and this is really because of the depth of these raised bogs that we've got in this area. They're talking about 1,290 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Okay, so this is just a summary which I've slightly simplified from one of the tables in the Greg paper, and you can see the kind of detail there, the different kinds of peatland habitat and land use. And what's interesting, the red figures are where it is losing carbon to the atmosphere, and the point is made that peatland in general in this country is in such a poor state that it is a net carbon emitter. There's a tremendous opportunity there, a need to actually improve that, to improve the carbon balance of peatlands and turning it from a net emitter to a net sequestrator. And you can see with the green figures for re-wetted, modified, and also near natural fen type landscapes, you can see that has got a balance which is the other way. You also see that those figures are quite low. You can compare, for example, the figure for cropland, the second one from the top, with these ones for improved or natural peatland, you can see that you're making a big change, but you're not going to be capturing a huge amount, but you're going to be preventing a major source of emissions. And emissions from land use and land use change in this country are one of the big factors to consider in the whole kind of climate debate. And here they give some figures for what happens when you do make those changes to peatland, which are quite interesting. They show that there are some possibilities, and what's really interesting is if you restore actively eroding peatland to drained, even that saves nearly 20 tonnes per hectare. This is per year. All these figures for flux are per year, and so on. You can see the figures there. So there are real scope for improvements. But that's just the peatlands. What about the other stuff? About the arable land and the woodland? Well, arable land, generally speaking, is a net emitter, fairly small emitter, but nevertheless an emitter of carbon. But improvements to management can change this. There's a website called the Farm Carbon Toolkit, which suggests that you can actually save nearly a tonne per hectare annually by simply increasing the soil carbon by 1,000th, 0.01%. No, that's a 10,000th, isn't it, of the soil carbon? And you can do that quite easily by just changing the kind of tillage practices. And woodland, however, is a really important sequestrator, as I'm sure you all know, with that figure, 10 tonnes per hectare for deciduous woodland. And the carbon stores in broadleaf woodland are around 260 tonnes per hectare. So that's, again, a highly significant figure. So when you lose woodland, you're again losing carbon into the atmosphere. And even if you're planting trees, it's going to take a while to catch up again. And quite interestingly, they're saying that in wetter areas of the north and west of England, which typically have more acidic soil, as we saw on the previous slide, it's the case here. Non-native conifers are often capable of sequestering more carbon than broadleaves, which surprised me. I didn't think that was the case. It may be just because conifers do grow so quickly. Okay, so here's a kind of a ballpark figure which I calculated from a study looking at the carbon emissions from land use change across the whole country. And I came up from that and looking at the area of development in a year with about 0.53 kilotons per hectare. So what's that? That's 500 tons of carbon per hectare, and that was in a recent year. But of course, that's an average figure, and it's probably really only useful for sort of sense checking. If you've done some calculations and you want to see whether they look feasible, that gives you a bit of an idea of kind of what you might be looking at. But of course, the devil's really in the detail. I then looked at constructional and embodied emissions, so those from the new buildings, and I ran into a bit of a problem with some wildly different figures. So the first pair, indicated by the first pair of arrows, for me that gives a much lower figure. And I haven't got to the bottom of this. I can't really understand why those sources are giving such a low figure. And interestingly, when I checked the figures from the Empty Homes Agency, which I think was it was the secondary source that was referred to by a tertiary source that Marge found. They cited 50 tonnes per hectare per house. But when I tracked back to the primary source, I only managed to get 2.9 tonnes per house, so I was really puzzled. But then I found some other figures from the Green Building Council, and I think perhaps particularly significantly from the Institute of Structural Engineers, and they're giving much higher figures, which seem to be closer to kind of what I certainly understood to be the kind of amounts of embodied carbon that you've got when you build. So a bit more work needs doing on that, just to sort of resolve some of those difficulties. I'm a bit inclined perhaps to trust the Institute of Structural Engineers, because they've got a very, very thorough, highly detailed database there, where they've looked at the different kinds of materials that go into buildings, and you can see the kind of path by which they've calculated them. On the other hand, the rock study, or ROC study, cited in the first paragraph, again was a study of buildings across a number of countries, mostly in Europe. And I can't believe that they'd be so very different from those here. So just goes to show that this kind of work it isn't so very easy. What about operational emissions then? Well, the previous study by Roke and colleagues comes up with these figures, which again I've translated into estimates for 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom houses. The two columns here for the standard buildings and the new advanced buildings. The standard buildings are roughly what we're building to now, so they're better than we used to. Where I live, we've got a fairly new extension built about 12 years ago, and it's really noticeable just how much warmer that is from the rest of the house, even though we've got things like cavity wall insulations in the rest of the house. Clearly, it's built to a higher insulation standard, and we weren't even trying terribly hard then. We were just following, at that point, the standard kind of building practices. So it has improved. But you can see from the new advanced building standard, which is a bit of a kind of an amalgam of low energy design and right down to sort of passive house standard. But even then, of course, you've still got activities going on. So even though you're not spending in a passive house, you're not spending expending energy and additional energy on the heating. You are on the other activities that go to living in a house. So that gives a bit of a figure you can use. So if you've got 100 houses, you can sort of scale up those figures and say, look, this development is going to, over time, every year, emit this much carbon. But of course, it's going to change, because we're going to be decarbonising the heat systems that we use to heat our houses. We're continuing to decarbonise the energy supply. Building standards will get better. Houses will get retrofitted and so on. Okay, so you also need to think about the specifics of the site. So what happens when foundations are constructed on peatland? So I've been given kind of quite sort of bald overall figures, but again, we need the sort of the detail. We need to know a bit about, if you're going to build on peatland here, what's going to happen to the peat? Is it going to be carted off and sold off for people to grow their pot plants in, or is it going to be in some way kind of protected and restored underneath the buildings? What's going on here? How much is being disturbed? How deep are they going with the foundations, and all those kinds of things? What about changes to the water system, drainage, wetting? You're putting down a lot more hard surfaces, so you'll be getting more runoff, but also you're reducing the natural kind of sponginess of the landscape as well. So again, it would be helpful to have a bit of a better understanding of some of that. And then if there's trees on the site, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be burnt? Is the timber going to be used? Is it going to be shredded? Again, that matters really. And also don't forget the carbon consequences of new economic activity. So you're putting a new development in, and there's going to be emissions from the other consequences of building. So think, for example, of the travel to work to and from the building, or what about all the workers that are putting up all these 200,000 houses across Greater Manchester, if places for everyone is going to be believed? Well, there's going to be a lot of salary paid to those workers. What are they going to spend it on? What's the carbon footprint of their consumption, and so on? You see what I mean? That it's not just a matter of the buildings that are going up, but there are knock-on consequences, multiplier effects, if you like. Okay, so I'm coming near to the end now. You've got your various sources of information, and you need to then put them together. And this is a kind of an example then of a spreadsheet that you could make to do some of those calculations. So you'll see the different kind of land types, the figures for flux from the literature, the figures for the store from the literature, and then it's simply a matter of multiplying the two together. Multiply the area by the flux per hectare per year, and you'll get the total flux figure. These aren't real figures, because you see I've just put some tens here and then split that down for the type of peat bog when we're looking at the flux in more detail. So these illustrative areas you replace with your own figures, and you'll be able to do a calculation. So I've done the calculation for just the housing development for New Carrington, and all this information is in the New Carrington Master Plan from which is on. It's actually not on Places for Everyone. It's on the old 2020 Greater Manchester Spatial Framework archive. So the area involved is 179.7 hectares, 5,000 and odd housing units. I calculate the flux at minus 29, so a net emission per year from that land, and I calculate a carbon store in that land of 3.3 kilotons. The embodied carbon in the housing is 179 kilotons. So again, all the time I've used the kind of best guess figures. And I can show you the spreadsheet so you can see a bit more about the detail of how I've done that in a minute or two. Okay, I just now want to stress the limitations of this kind of work. Firstly, land types are estimated from examining maps and satellite pictures. So you're drawing the best conclusions you can, but you haven't really got the real detail. You're not taking kind of, you're not drilling down, taking cores of the land and seeing what's under there. You're not doing a detailed kind of audit of the vegetation and so on. You don't know exactly what they're building and what it's going to be made of. So again, these are estimates. That's okay, because we're trying to provide estimates rather than precise calculations. The onus has to be on those with more resources, the developers, councils and so on, to do the job properly. And we need to be pressing them to actually tell us what the carbon implications of these plans are. And they need to do that in terms of the National Planning Framework, and also in terms of the Climate Change Act, certainly as I read it. Just going on then, there are guesstimates of the land types that are not in the study. So the area of former industrial land or degraded former agricultural land, I was having to make a best guess really as to what the figures would be for that. in terms of the fluxes and stores. And the peatland stores could certainly be an underestimate given the depth. Of course, errors in my spreadsheet and in my kind of logic as well. Beware of that. At school, I was always being told I was very prone to make careless mistakes in maths, and I'm afraid I still do. Luckily, I've got friends that can usually pick those up. Okay, that's it. That's where you can contact me. It's really over to you to kind of run with this kind of methodology if that's what you think would be useful to do. I can also show you, if you like, my spreadsheet, just to get which I'll just quickly show you.
Yes, let's look at that before we hand over for questions, Mark.
Oh,
That'd be a good idea.
Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yep, you can. Okay. So again, the headline figures I've just shared with you at the top here come up from a summary. Really, all I wanted to show you was that here I've taken basically the these first 4 columns here are from the New Carrington master plan. So I've simply kind of just pasted that information in. In fact, no, it's the first. It's all these columns up to here, up to column F, and then I've categorized them in terms of the current coverage. Now, in most cases like this one, it's all the same, so I've just put 100%, so only this column applies. Sometimes it looked like there was a mix, so again, I've used 2 types, and I've apportioned them by an estimated percentage. So this is all me kind of making best guesses about the land type and the proportions of it, where that applies. And you'll see that I've then, we go down here, okay. Yeah, so then, trying to remember what I did, I then totaled up the columns here. Sorry, here. Somewhere. Oh no, I didn't know. Sorry, just remembering what I did here. So then I carried them over here and made the totals here. So yeah, I simply carried this over. So 100% of 9 hectares gives you 9.1 total. And then I kind of bring the columns down, add them up, bung in the flux estimates and the store estimates, and then I calculate the summary figure. And here are my notes as to kind of what I've done here. So that one was a guesstimate because I didn't have the category. This was a store figure based on the average from the UK Soil Observatory map. This was a store estimate cited for the study on the Manchester mosses and so on. And then there are my totals coming across. So that's basically all I did. And then for the embodied, again, I did a similar thing using those figures from earlier, assuming an average of 3 bedrooms for New Carrington, which may be wrong, but again, it gives you an idea. Taking the mid-range figure, really, I think it was the mid-range between the Institute of Structural Engineers and the Green Building Council, applying that. So there we get the figures. It's then probably, I suppose, just a parting shot, really. is that it's worth, stop the share now. It's worth then cross-referencing that with the kind of carbon budgets that we're dealing with. So the Greater Manchester carbon budget is in the order of 50 megatons of carbon over the period to 2038. Essentially, that's the amount of carbon that's allowed to be released into the atmosphere. And you will have figures that can then be scaled down for Trafford. Some of the boroughs, like Manchester, have actually got their own carbon budget. Again, all done by the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester. So again, we can get a sense of how significant these carbon figures are in relation to those. So there we are. I think broadly, I would say the flux changes aren't going to be huge. And really, there's a kind of another bit of learning from that, that if you're thinking of nature-based solutions for greenhouse gases and climate change, you're going to need an awful lot of land to capture the carbon from the atmosphere, because it doesn't do that at a hugely great rate per year. It does, and it's important, and we can't afford to lose forests, we can't afford to lose carbon capturing grasslands and so on. But nevertheless, in the scale of things, it's not huge compared to the amount that we're burning in Greater Manchester, say. Much more significant are the embodied emissions, the construction emissions, the operational emissions, but also the damage, the potential damage to the carbon stores, where you're, through the practices of development, you're releasing a whole lot more carbon. So that's basically me finished. I'll take questions.
Super. Does anybody have any questions for Mark? Do you want to put your hands up? And just while we're waiting for the questions to come through, I just wanted to mention, really, this is work in progress, guys. So thank you so much for it, Mark, because I think it'll be very useful for all the groups, actually. And things that we need to consider and develop further are things like, for us here in Carrington, as you all probably know, we've got the Carrington Relief Road coming through, and the users of that relief road will also be carbon emitters. There'll be embodied carbon in the production of the cars, even the ones that have electric. In fact, there may be even higher embodied emissions from battery use. I think there's some conversations to be had on that. And of course the HGVs, and I'll say a little bit more about that after people have raised the questions. The other thing just to mention about New Carrington and on this particular one, obviously the peak depths are quite deep in places, but there will be less at the perimeters. So Mark's absolutely right in making some guesstimates here. I don't think there's any problem with guesstimates. Trafford can't provide us with any information at all. They can't even tell us how many cars or HGVs are going to be running on the Carrington Relief Road when all the development is done, which is really bizarre that they're approving a road and they don't know how many cars are going to be going on it. Mark, another thing, just a couple of points from my perspective. We did some research about carbon emissions per hectare, and the different researchers, as you quite rightly pointed out, are coming up with different figures. And I don't know whether Paul will say a few words about this, but there are a lot of researchers, and we do need to look into this in a bit more detail. And of course, the other thing for us having a peat moss is if they drain those peatlands or pile the peat, all the carbon that's currently captured in the peat, yes, it might be an emitter at the moment, but if they drain it or pile it, then we will have one big.
It'll be even worse, yes.
Yeah, a huge carbon emissions event. Anyway, we've got 3 hands up. So, Gay, you're at the top of my list. Do you want to jump in with your question? And you're just on mute, Gay, so you'll need to come off mute, folks, to ask your questions.
I know that Carrington Moss Park floods. I just wondered what damage or detriment it is to the peat because of this, or because peat needs to be kept wet. Does it make no difference?
It's a good point. I mean, the moss, there are a lot of parts of the moss that are underwater for a lot of the year. But for part of the year, they will be emitting because they're not underwater at that time. So I think the very wetness of our moss will be a benefit. But because it is so degraded, it will undoubtedly be an emitter. I don't know whether, Paul, you want to jump in with Paul Beckman. You want to jump in with any thoughts on that?
Yeah, congratulations to Mark. I think he made a great deal of sense out of a very complicated issue. And I don't suppose that you'll ever get 100% accuracy, whoever may look at it. But anyway, I mean, yes, I think following on from Gay's question, I was wondering, Mark, the carbon emissions from peat, is that per square metre, or does it include a certain depth?
Yes, you're talking about the area, so per square metre or per hectare. But of course, the dynamics differ quite a bit depending on the depth. But I think, well, actually, I think probably the flux figures don't differ a great deal depending on the depth until you start disturbing it. That's me guessing. I do know that it's tremendously complicated. So, you know, the issue of water affects carbon dioxide and methane in opposite directions.
Yes.
And then you've got the question of particulates being washed out with the water and so on. If you've got flooding, so if the land is draining away too quickly, you've also got that as a carbon loss. So yes, again, the specifics are terribly important here.
I mean, one of the problems is that you get what they call a perched water table in peatlands, particularly in basin peat. And I know birchwood moss, that had quite a substantial perched water table in it, which was evident at one time. But I mean, the difficulty is that, as you say, it's a very complicated issue. And I noticed that Salford, in their policies for developing on mossland in the places for everyone, they said that they weren't prepared to do any schedule any housing without doing further research on the effects on the water table of the mossland, because clearly they realised that they could do irreparable damage.
That's really sensible. So,
yeah. But I mean, the other thing I was going to ask was, in terms of building on peat, you can't build houses on peat. You'd have to take it all off. But equally, I think there's an example in Ireland of where they'd done precisely that. They'd taken the peat off where they built the houses, but left it under the roads. And the result was that the roads shrank 2 or 3 feet below the houses. So it's not a good idea. It was only a small estate. I think it's 15 houses. But I mean, the point I'm getting at is that I presume where the housing is going to go, you would have to strip off the entire depth of peat and replace it with inert fill. So you've got another carbon factor.
Yes. Or that aggregate. That's right. Yeah.
So I mean, it's adding yet another degree of complexity to it.
It is. Yeah.
But good luck.
I don't know whether they could, to drive piles in and almost kind of construct it on a platform above the peat. But again, you've got the question of what's then happening to the peat even if you do that.
Well,
So,
you've got
yeah.
services would be shrinking then as well.
Yes,
You'd
yes,
end up
indeed.
with ruptured gas mains and
Yes,
oh.
yeah. Mm.
So I think
one way or another, it's going to be either drained or piled or removed, isn't it?
yeah,
It
yeah.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
And I can just see the developers sort of eyeing it up, thinking, oh yeah, we can make a bit from that. Yeah.
But the costs of this, of course, are quite, because it adds complexity to the development, and this is one of the reasons why the viability of the schemes in New Carrington is so close to the, so finely balanced, let's put it that way. So we only have a 15% affordable housing number for New Carrington, and it only hits the viability numbers once the affordable housing has been reduced from 30% to 15%, and the pricing has been increased by 10%, the pricing of the houses. So the viability is quite limited, if you like. It's quite finely balanced, I think.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, Marge, that I mean, as we saw with the Redrow proposals in Warburton here, the affordable housing is discounted against the development costs of the land itself. So if you're taking the peat out, that goes against the number of affordable houses. So I'm guessing there will be no affordable houses. In fact, they'll probably be wanting assistance to deal with the peat.
Mm-hmm. That would not surprise me. That would not surprise me.
But that gets interesting, doesn't it? Because one of the arguments that developers are using about brownfield sites is the cost of mitigating them before you can build on it. Well, it's beginning to sound like there's maybe no great advantage of building somewhere like this.
Agree.
Although I think to be on the other, play devil's advocate a bit, there's not a whole lot of the peatland that's going to be built on for housing. A lot of it's doesn't appear to be the peatland.
I think there are some quite distinct areas that are going to be built on for housing and employment land. And Trafford talk about this green corridor that isn't really green, that runs through the middle, that's got 80 hectares of businesses on it, including Man United and United Utilities and Sale Sharks and all these other organisations. So I think there is some consideration got to be given for that. But let's just go on to the next question then. Julie, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come off mute?
Yep, am I okay now?
You are?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Mark. It was really interesting. I wish you could present that to Trafford Council, which I don't think will happen. It's not so much a question as a comment. I've read an article by a science and environmental journalist, Tom Pearce. It's in the Telegraph about, you mentioned developers will often promise to plant trees to compensate for everything they're doing. This is new research, and he's found that actually planted trees don't do very well at all. They do rather badly. They either die or need a lot of care, and that's a far more useful way ahead in terms of using trees and natural landscape to help with climate change will be not to plant at all, to simply protect and regenerate the world's existing woodlands and forests. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence coming through to show that he's right. In China, the policy of grain for green has gone wrong, and Cambridgeshire County Council, who've planted loads of trees along the sides of motorways and roads, have said recently most of them have actually failed. And I just wondered if you had any awareness of that. It's a bit beside the point, because you just mentioned developers promising trees in passing, but it was an article that made me think quite a lot, which I'm quite happy to pass on to Marge to you.
Yes, please. Yeah, do that.
Yeah.
And I think, Mark, it's an interesting one, isn't it, that perhaps what we need to build into the model is things that are certainties and things that are subject to cost and other things, including the success of planting such as this.
Yes, it's clearly an issue. I'm not sure it's true to say that they always fail, but and actually we saw from the example of non-native conifer species growing that in wet areas, they actually seem to be quite a good option. Likewise, people talk about for short rotation coppice for sort of biofuels and so on. But I think what it highlights to me is that there is no easy correspondence between what you're destroying and what you're then putting back in to replace. So there's kind of assumed to be almost like sort of calculus. On the one hand, you can you've got some costs, and on the other hand, you've got some mitigations or some benefits, and you can make them cancel out. But actually, it doesn't really work like that. It's it's a lot more complicated. But there will be a number of different options for how you create ecologically valuable landscapes, and some of that will be via sort of natural regeneration and essentially rewilding as well as cultivated options.
Thanks.
Okay, Jeff, you've got your hand up too. Want to jump in?
Yes, indeed. I've got several points here. First is going back to the Irish example. What they did was they piled through underneath the houses and provide piles through the peat onto the bedrock below. And my query is it bedrock below the peat, or is it something else?
I've not looked at that, so I'm afraid I don't know. It could well be no, but it's fairly easy to do that. If you go to the British Geological Survey, there will be a layer you can apply to the area using their sort of mapping tool, and you can see what the bedrock would be.
Right. My point being that piling isn't a solution if you don't have bedrock below. That's the small point there. The other thing, going back to the success of planting trees, because I've done a lot with National Trust and others, the success rate, or perhaps more to the point, the failure rate of trees can be as little as 15%, but can be as high as 80%, depending on what the weather conditions are you get in the year that you actually plant them. If you get a drought like we had in 2020, you will get a relatively poor success rate. If you get a fairly wet summer like we had in 2021, you'll get a fairly high success rate with planted trees. Typically, you average a loss of about 15% per annum, which is why they mob plant on the basis that they will lose 15% per annum in the first 4 or 5 years. Then you're left with something of the order of about sort of 50% of what you started with. They've become 5-year-old trees by that time, and they will grow. My third little point is when I spoke to one of the landowners a little while back, he said that for the replacement of trees which they were taking down, they were going to do 2 new trees for each one they were taking down. When I had a tree taken down outside, the council said, they classified one mature tree as equivalent to 400 new planted trees.
Wow.
That's a lot of difference between 2 and 400. The replacement.
Indeed, yes.
No, there is. That's a really good point, Jeff. Really good point. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, Julie, your hand is up again. Did you have another question? Or did you just not lower your hand? No.
Yeah, I just didn't lower my hand. But what I would say is the article didn't say they all failed. I accept that some don't. It's just that it's a worse option than protecting what is there already. and also new trees take quite a long time to actually be contributing to taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. They're not going to do
really important point.
Yeah.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So Paul Beckman, you have your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to follow on from what Jeff was saying about tree failures. I mean, when I used to work for Warrington Newtown, and we had there 99% of tree failures there were due to waterlogging of the pits. And I think with the weather we're getting nowadays, we're getting extreme wet conditions and extreme drought conditions. So it's not good for trees in any case. But a further point is that the government has banned giving grants for tree planting on peatland.
Yeah.
So I presume, even if all this housing goes in, I think I've mentioned this to you before, Marge, if this housing goes in, it's not going to be screened in any way whatsoever.
No.
It'll be on full view from right across the moss.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, we'll come on to the relief road in a minute. No, it's a very good point. So Jeff, you've got your hand up as well.
Indeed.
Got another point?
One other point about trees that the council plant, they tend to plant them in hard areas quite often and just put a watering tube in beside them. If there is no maintenance of the trees, i.e. watering of them during drought, they won't grow very well.
No.
Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know that even from planting trees on Danewell Park, which I've done a lot of, and you have to spend a lot of time making sure that they are watered effectively and given a little bit of TLC. Otherwise, they don't come through. Okay. Any other questions for Mark just before I make a couple of points about the carbon emissions from the road? Any other points? No. So I want to just share. Oh, somebody has put a hand up. Sarah, jump in.
Yeah, it's me. Don't worry if this is going to take up too much time, but I'm just curious about the fact that it's that the moss is in a state of degeneration or you know it's poor quality, which could be brought up to being better quality, but at the moment I'm just wondering about that process. But don't worry if you want to crack on.
I think, well, the top and bottom of it is in Lancashire Wildlife Trust have been restoring the peat mosses there, and they have some proven processes that can be used. And in a very relatively short period of time, they've been doing stuff for about 10 years. They have done some wonderful things with some of the mosslands in Lancashire. So this is something that we can do. The sad thing is that Trafford have a carbon neutral action plan, which they published last December, and it doesn't even mention that they've got 2 peat mosses. So Carrington moss, which is the second largest peat moss in the whole of Greater Manchester, and Warburton moss, which is a smaller moss. So Trafford has 2 peat mosses, and they're not even mentioned in its carbon neutral action plan. But they could restore both of these mosses to support carbon sequestration. And just restoring them and re-wetting them will reduce the emissions that are currently being released. So it's probably several stages in the project. And then, of course, you have the areas of agricultural land, some of which have peat moss underneath them. And it's whether we try and persuade some of those farmers to look at moving towards paludiculture, which is wet farming. So looking at growing crops that survive in wetter conditions. And what that would mean is that we could, at some point in the future, our children, grandchildren, as things become clearer and the climate emergency and the issues around it become clearer, our children and grandchildren can make decisions to restore the moss or to continue to grow crops on this very rich peatland soil. But if we build on it, if we put roads and houses and industrial units on it, we can't build on it. It's, you know, it's lost to us because, as others have said, the peat will be removed, so or drained totally. And let's not kid ourselves, folks, that we can build on a little tiny bit of the moss and it won't affect the rest of it. If we do what's planned, then the moss will die, because the birds and the wildlife won't be able to survive with the level of pollution, air, noise and light pollution. Will eradicate the species. The agricultural land will be lost, so a lot of their breeding and feeding grounds will be lost. A lot of the food sources for the birds and wildlife will be gone, and the human footprint, whether it be cars or people themselves, will disturb the wildlife and birds to the point that they won't be surviving. So this idea that we can have sites of biological importance sitting next to a dual carriageway with 200 HGVs at the moment going along it, that's before all the industrial units are fully let. So we have 200 HGVs an hour during rush hour, and over 135 typically in the other main hours of the day. But bear in mind that Carrington residents at the moment have a petition to try and reduce the hours that these HGVs are operating, because they are operating 24 hours a day. They're running day and night. They're waking people up. There are people suffering from significant mental health problems as a consequence of the disturbances that these HGVs are causing. And all of that noise, light and air pollution is all coming to Sale West. That's what's going to happen. So instead of fixing the problem, they are just moving it to another community. That is the challenge that we have. And obviously we've had a number of different solutions which Trafford has refused to discuss with us. And when I say we here, I don't just mean Friends of Carrington Moss. I mean ourselves plus the 3 parish councils that are significantly affected have come up with ideas and questions that Trafford have refused to answer. We've asked for workshops, which they've ignored our requests, so we've asked over and over again, and they have refused our requests. And as many of you will know, we submitted a petition against roads going across Carrington Moss a couple of weeks ago. 1,600 people signed that petition, and Trafford have agreed nothing as the consequence. So we asked for more engagement, and so basically they've ignored the requests of everybody that is supporting the campaign that we're running. And in terms of both traffic numbers and carbon emissions, Trafford cannot provide us with any information whatsoever. So they're making decisions about bringing in roads and what have you without actually understanding the impact of those roads on the existing communities and the health of those communities. So, for example, the children at All Saints School, where all the traffic, 70% of the car traffic from the new development is expected to go up the Carrington Spur, but of course it will be 100% of the HGVs, because there isn't anywhere else for them to go, because Trafford has refused to consider the alternative that we put to them of a bridge across the ship canal. Now, the bridge across the ship canal was highlighted as a proposal in the 2012 core strategy, and it's not been looked at since. And what the benefit of the bridge across the ship canal would be is that it is a truly sustainable solution. Yes, there would be embodied carbon in the building of the bridge, but actually what we're proposing is that the HGVs, when they get to the other side, go to Earlham Wharf or Port Salford. That means the HGVs are no longer on the country's roads, whereas building this new road, this Carrington Relief Road, means that 100% of HGVs will be on the roads, full stop. There's not even an attempt to improve the sustainability of the solution. Now, one option, of course, would be to put a wharf at the Carrington side of the ship canal and put all the goods onto a wharf at the Carrington side of the ship canal. But Trafford keeps approving more and more and more developments in Carrington. And even now, yet more developments are coming forward. Another power station, another more industrial works. So, you know, we're in a position here where Trafford are not looking strategically at sustainable solutions for the industrial area that they have already. And we've worked with Partington, with Warburton and with Carrington Parish Councils to come up with much cheaper alternatives to building the road across the peat moss. Even if we don't have the bridge, much cheaper alternatives. But Trafford won't listen to them. There is no forum for us to talk to them about them. And they're not interested in anything other than the growth agenda, which is why this Carrington Relief Road is being built. And it's being built so that these 5,000 houses and the 350,000 square meters of industrial and warehousing space can be built on Carrington Moss. Plus, in total, there will be 4 roads, this dual carriageway, plus 3 other major new roads across the moss. So you can see that there isn't going to be a lot of moss left. And the idea that there will be improvements to sites of biological importance and unique habitats with all of that going on is just a nonsense. It's just an absolute nonsense. And in Trafford's option appraisal report, for the Carrington Relief Road, one of the sections in the report is about the estimated carbon emissions for the 2 routes. Now, the 2 routes are made up of 2 bits. Each of the 2 routes includes opening up the A1 road at the back of Carrington. So we're going to ignore that bit because it's the same for both routes. The other part of the option is either to improve the existing road, which we believe that there are ways that can be done, not as outlined in this options appraisal, which is very biased and full of what's the word? It's constructed in such a way that option A could not be chosen. And the other route is option F, which is the route across the peat moss. And despite the fact that it's a route across the peat moss, despite the fact that option F would have to be a new road, a totally new road built for this, for the purpose, Trafford's estimates of the carbon emissions are astounding. Let me share the screen very briefly. And this is why Mark's report is so important, Mark's work. So option A is to upgrade the existing route. So the existing A6144 between the Carrington Spur and say Isherwood Road. And option F is to build a totally new road across Carrington Moss, with all the requirements that go with building a new road. And you can see that option F has been calculated as having fewer carbon emissions than option A.
But of course, look what's in the calculation there.
Yeah.
They haven't included all the stuff on essentially the carbon stores and their disturbance.
No, they haven't. But even so, they are building a new road. So how can the construction of a brand new road be less carbon emissions, even if all the bits around? Because I mean, for those who have seen our blog on this options appraisal, you'll be aware that Natural England had some very challenging things to say to Trafford about their choice of option F. In fact, their words, and I shall read them to you. I can share them on the screen, in fact, in a minute, which might be better because it's there, and they've said something similar in the Places for Everyone inputs that they've made. But what I don't get, Mark, is how you can have the carbon emissions of constructing a brand new road as coming out at less than the carbon emissions for upgrading an existing route. It does not make sense.
No.
So I want to look into this in a lot of detail. The other thing is that they say that this has been created in line with PAS 2080 guidance. I've been talking to some experts on that, and it doesn't appear to follow that guidance. I'll just very quickly share with you find the what Natural England said about those two route options. So Natural England said, "We are disappointed that the findings of the environmental desktop study are not fully reflected in the appraisal of the route options. Appendix D contains slightly more information on the environmental constraints, but is not an accurate representation." Now, for an organisation like Natural England to be telling a local authority that their report is not making an accurate representation of the facts is appalling. And then on the risks, which is something that we picked up as well in our feedback on the report, we think this represents an inaccurate and unbalanced view of the environmental constraints. It is Natural England's view that option F would be considerably more damaging than option A. So again, very strong words from Natural England. And so it appears to us that the report, the options appraisal report, is very biased. And this is why, guys, and let me just going to stop